So, hey, great book. You cover like all the bases in this thing.
Well, thank you.
Trial by fire.
Oh, thank you. Well, there it is.
Because, you covered the fire,
Sure.
the owners, the prosecution, the cops, the whole works. And of course, it's like 15 years through it. But, I mean, you couldn't tell this story unless you waited 15 years to see how it all shook down.
Well, and also some people wouldn't speak. Some people have been steadfastly silent for all of these years. It's really kind of amazing. So yeah, the 15 years refers to like when I stopped the story in the book. So in other words, after the memorial is done and after the final people who I really figure are the kind of the keys to the story finally telling me things. So that's where the timeline ends at the 15-year mark. So are we starting now? How do you want to do this? Tell me.
Yeah, we can start this. Welcome to City's Blood Podcast, Scott. We appreciate your time. And
thank you for having me.
We've kind of
thanks.
I guess we started already in a way, which is great. And I was kind of interested myself is how you got interested to focus in on this topic and then decide to write the book.
Sure. Well,
you spend all those years on this subject too.
Well, look, wow. I grew up in a suburb of Providence, so I'm a local guy, and I really considered this to be kind of the worst thing that ever happened where I grew up. And I live in California. I've lived here for a long time, and in fact, I had moved here many, many years before there was a fire. But when I would go home, my family and friends would say, this fire thing, we feel like we never got the full story. We feel like there was never justice in the case. And after hearing this for so many years, I decided about 10 years ago to start asking some questions. And my background was in journalism. I had worked in journalism in that town, in that area, in that state. I was a news director at a TV station there for about 8 years. So I had some contacts. In fact, somebody I knew who used to work for me a million years ago, an employee of mine, was one of the co-owners of the nightclub. And I'd found out that he had never spoken and never told his version of events. So I went back to him and I asked him if he would speak to me. And that's when I found out how much he hated the news media and how he had pledged he would never, ever speak to another journalist. So it actually took a long time, years, to gain his trust for him to tell me anything. And then eventually he introduced me to his brother. And eventually I was able to access what were would have been the defense materials had there ever been a trial. But there had never been any trials. And so the only version of events that had ever been presented was the one from the government or from the news media. And so I soon discovered that there was more to the story than just that.
Oh, there sure was. I mean, man, I can't say it's the feel-good book of the year, but it's a great read.
Well, I mean, look, I hate, one of the things I like to remind people of is that, there are some unbelievably inspirational stories that come out of this. In fact, people say that the book, touched them emotionally. I mean, I have a lot of people who cry when they read the book, but they don't cry during the horror, and there is a lot of horror. The book is tough. The first act one is very tough when you are in the fire and you see what happened to these poor people. But some of these people go on to do incredible things, and that's when people get emotional. They're like, wow, I can't believe that person literally was left for dead inside an inferno, and not only did they rebuild their life, but they went on to do incredible things to help other people. It's just, in that way, it is a triumph of the human spirit. But then as you follow these people, and they are the central characters in this book, but around it is the journalism that raises questions about our legal system, the criminal justice system. I mean, you can understand why people back there felt there was no justice or that they didn't get justice. I mean, the local law did not allow for anyone to be held criminally responsible for hurting people. So we had 100 people who were killed, but you had hundreds of others who were hurt, and there was no mechanism in the law to hold anyone accountable for the people who were hurt. And we're talking about hundreds of people, some of them burned horribly. They will deal with their injuries for the rest of their lives. So to be told by the Attorney General is that we've got nothing for you. There'll be nothing for you at all. Those people, those hundreds of people, feel that they never got justice. in the case. So you've got that, and that's just for starters in all of this.
Yeah.
There were never any criminal charges brought up against anybody with the pyrotechnic crew or the
Yeah, there were criminal charges, but there were never any trials. And so what happened is people were pressured into taking plea bargains. So we should probably just step back and remind people what happened here. Just the scenario is that you had a rock band, Jack Russell's Great White, famous for a song called Once Bitten, Twice Shy. They were a big kind of hair band of the 80s and into the early 90s. And so they performed at this small roadside club called The Station in West Warwick, Rhode Island. And to start their show, kind of evocative of their days when they used to fill stadiums, they shot off fireworks, 15-foot fireworks in a club with 12-foot ceilings. The club caught on fire, went up like an inferno, because the walls of the club were all lined with soundproofing foam that turned out to be highly flammable. It was the equivalent of solid gasoline. And in fact, there were about 13 gallons worth of this gasoline on the walls of the club. It went up in an instant, and in 90 seconds was the time. If you were in that club at the 90-second mark after the club caught fire, you probably were dead. It happened that quickly that the place went up. So you had hundreds of people who need to be evacuated in a very short amount of time. Everything went wrong simultaneously. Basically, our instinct when we're put in a situation like that we have to flee, we automatically trace our steps. How did I get in here? I'm going to go out what I remember in my brain, which is how I got in. So most people go for the entrance. So you've got this bottleneck that creates a jam up, and many of the victims, most of the victims, die right there at that door, as it's just filled to capacity with people trying to get out in such a short amount of time. So people didn't have a chance. The place was basically a death trap. And so when it came time to determining if anyone should face any criminal charges, the Attorney General's office picked 3 people. One was the tour manager, basically the roadie, who set off the fireworks. Fireworks were illegal. They were not allowed under state law. They were not allowed in that venue. He snuck them in over state lines. And the 2 owners of the nightclub business. These are guys who owned the nightclub establishment, not the actual building. They didn't own the Death Trap building. They were renters, but they ran the business, and they were the ones who were criminally charged. And that's it. The building wasn't properly inspected. Otherwise, they would have caught that this foam that was on the walls had been there for years, by the way. Some of it predated even the ownership of the club. And none of that was caught, none of that was discovered. And a lot of people thought that the fire inspector should have been held responsible for failing to do a proper inspection with the building. The company that sold the foam to the nightclub and did not disclose that it was highly flammable foam instead of sound foam. Sound foam by law, any of us who have worked in studios, radio studios, television studios, they're lined with this foam. It's what creates the acoustics that we enjoy. That by law must be flame resistant, flame retardant. What was sold to the nightclub, even though everyone knew it was going to be used indoors, was packing foam, which is highly flammable. So a lot of people thought, well, those people at the foam company who sold this foam to these people, they should be held criminally accountable. But that never happened either. So that was the other part where people thought there was injustice, that not enough people who were culpable in this were held criminally responsible. So the focus was very narrow as to who should be criminally pursued. And there are a whole bunch of other people who think, well, this was obviously just a terrible accident, that nobody intended to hurt anybody. The band members, Jack Russell, the leader of the band, he was not held criminally responsible either, and people didn't like that. So there was a lot of complaints about how narrow the focus was of the criminal investigation.
That would aggravate me. Just the fact that I understand the guitar player, lost his life in the fire, but I mean, the fact that the band wasn't held responsible because, it's not the roadie that decides I got to have these pyrotechnics for my show. And to be honest with you, I've seen the footage. Dave sent it to me the other day that showed the inside of the club. And that was just absolutely ridiculous to have those size pyrotechnics going off in that small of a place. Yeah. And if you're the kind of band that needs those pyrotechnics, you're a crappy band. I mean, I lived through those time periods, and I'm sorry, but Great White sucked. They always did. Once Bitten, Twice Shy, I don't even think was their song. I think it's a remake of a 1975 song.
It's a cover.
It's Ian Hunter.
Cover. So I mean, these guys,
Ian Hunter song.
These guys were never, that. I mean, even Skid Row was like way up here compared to Great White. Just to listeners out there, Great White was never a great band. And, the fact I was honestly shocked myself that many people would actually go out to see Great White in 2003. I could see if it was like 1994 or something, maybe they could have filled the club. But 2003, I was really surprised.
Well, look, there's two things that you touch on there that are really important for people to remember. First of all, you referenced the video. So this is something that is a kind of a very cruel twist in this terrible, awful story. So in 2003, in 2020, in 2020, we are so used to the idea of catching things on tape. We all have our smartphones. Everything gets caught on video. But in 2003, the iPhone had not even been invented yet. There were no smartphones. It was very rare to catch tragedy on tape, especially something, a disaster of this proportion. And in this particular case, there was a local TV news crew that happened to be doing a story. What they were shooting was what's called generic B-roll. The photographer was sent to the club to shoot B-roll for an upcoming story unrelated to the club, really, and unrelated to what actually happened. And his story was about public venue safety. You can't make this up. So he's shooting a story for public venue safety, and he decides, he gets his footage, he's ready to go home, and he hears Great White's going to come up in a few minutes. He says, I'm going to stick around. I'm going to shoot the first 10 minutes of the show. The guys back at the TV station are going to love seeing, a little rock and roll, and I'll bring that back. So he is rolling as the band hits the stage, as the band sets off the fireworks, and then just happens to be there recording as this terrible, awful tragedy happens. And so this fire is captured from the inside on professional grade videotape. So it's probably one of the most documented tragedies in American history. And this fire video, it's why we know so much. It's why we know second by second what happened and what goes wrong, and we see it all with our own eyes. And you're right, you can see this video on YouTube. It's very disturbing to watch. I do not recommend that people look at it. Many of the people we see in that video don't survive. Remember, I talked about the 90-second mark.
Yeah.
So
all those people in the doorway, they're all piled up, and they're alive in there.
Yeah, it's something once you see it, you can't unsee it, and so I don't recommend that people look at that. But that jammed doorway is something that we can look at the video now, of course, frame by frame, and see the horror that's going on. But all of this plays out in seconds and nanoseconds. This awful tragedy. But because this was captured on video, this is now elevated. So first we have one of the deadliest fires in modern American history, really the deadliest fire since we had modern fire codes that kicked in after the Beverly Hills Supper Club disaster. Now it's on tape. So now the video goes viral. It is shown all over the world. It's probably seen by hundreds of millions of people. I talked to people when I was working on the book who first heard about the fire when they were on a remote Greek island, because it was carried by CNN, by everyone, because of that videotape. So it elevated what was a horrible disaster into this level of infamy that's really hard to imagine. And it was very, as happens when something like that happens, then all of the media from all over the world converges on this tiny little mill town, West Warwick, Rhode Island, and that adds its own level of trauma to people who are already suffering.
Right.
You mentioned it was the Supper Club fire. Was that the Coconut Grove fire that you were talking about?
Coconut Grove was even earlier. Coconut Grove was in the 1940s, around World War II time. And that is the deadliest fire, nightclub fire, or deadliest single building fire in American history. And they learned some lessons after Coconut Grove, but not the right lessons. I mean, look, this building in my book didn't have sprinklers. Neither did Coconut Grove. Neither did Beverly Hills Supper Club. Sprinklers were invented in the 1800s. This is not modern technology. It's not even difficult to do. But yet none of these places says, you would think that after Coconut Grove, we'd be like, okay, we got to get sprinklers in. And let's watch out for, highly flammable interiors, because that played a role in Coconut Grove. But that lesson wasn't learned. In Beverly Hills Supper Club, way overcrowded, way beyond capacity, way beyond legal capacity, but just way beyond common sense capacity. And people couldn't get out in time, and hundreds of people died there too. So so lessons are not really learned from these tragedies. And I'm frankly, part of my motivation for writing the book was that I'm not convinced that the lessons of 2003 were really learned. And the evidence would be what happened near us here in Oakland, the Ghost Ship fire in 2016. 36 people killed there by a building that was not safe. It was a death trap. It didn't have sprinklers. It wasn't properly inspected. And we could go through the whole litany of things yet again. And in that case, it's also interesting that, again, as far as the criminal aspect was concerned, the prosecutors narrowed their focus just to these two dudes. Once again, renters, the guys who were renting the building, they were the ones who were criminally charged, the only ones criminally charged. No one else was held responsible. And in that particular case, they went to the full trial, and the jury did not buy it. When they tried to blame everything on just these two guys, the jury refused to convict anyone, much to the shock of everyone. But when all the facts were laid out, it became more complicated. I think one of the lessons we learned with these tragedies is that the government does not indict itself. And so even when a situation where it seems like, the government has fallen down on the job, they don't hold any of their own accountable in these situations. So they look for others to pin 100% of the blame on. And it's not that simple.
Yeah. I think that the tour manager, the David Betchel, he was, he lit the fuse, as they say.
He did.
It wouldn't have happened if he wouldn't have done that.
Right. He did plead guilty, and he took a plea bargain. Unfortunately, his plea bargain basically was to serve about 18 months in prison for the deaths of 100 people. And there were a lot of reasons why that's what the resolution was. First of all, again, there was no intent. Just have to be clear here. Nobody intended for 100 people to die. And that's really important in criminal law. Intent is a lot of what we base our system is based on. So he didn't intend to hurt anyone. There's no way for him to know, although he did do something illegal with the fireworks. And in my book, I find new evidence that shows he was warned repeatedly of the dangers. There have been incidents involving other nightclubs where he was warned that he was putting lives at risk. But he didn't intend to hurt anyone, and there's no way for him to know that the walls of that club were covered in this solid gasoline that would go up like a torch. So those were extenuating circumstances in his favor. But when the guy got only about 18 months to serve for the deaths of 100 people, you can imagine the outrage in this tiny state where everybody knows everybody else. It seems like everybody in Rhode Island knew somebody who was in that fire. And people just lost it, and it's understandable. So then up next were these two nightclub business owners. They were headed for trial. So there was enormous pressure to try to send them away for the rest of their lives. And they were talked, they were painted as murderers and things like that. And the state really played up, may have overplayed what they had for evidence against the brothers. But there was enormous pressure for the brothers then to take some sort of plea bargain, which they eventually did as well. So that's why there was never a trial. Evidence was never vetted in court. Witnesses were never cross-examined to see if they were telling the truth. And so what I got to do is to go back and go through everything, all the thousands and thousands of pages of previously secret grand jury testimony, to really look at what do we know about this case, what did the government say, and what is maybe a counter argument to some of what the government claimed in this tragedy, so that people now have kind of a full spectrum of evidence laid out before them, and they can make their own decisions as to who they think is really culpable in all of this.
How did this book go over in Rhode Island, in that area?
Well, it's interesting. It's a source of an intense interest, to say the least. And I have been on, the talk radio shows and things like that, and on the local news as well. And so there's a lot of interest in it. For people who were directly impacted by the tragedy, it's a tough book to read. As you know,
Oh, yeah.
Act One goes right into the tragedy, and people, see what happened. The way I structure the book is that I pick a handful of people and tell their stories. So we are with them before, during, and after this tragedy.
Right.
So by selecting the few to represent the many, I'm able to really get into their heads. You see things happening through their eyes. But the people I pick are not random people. These are people who, as the story plays out, later play a role in how events unfold, whether they are the criminal events or other things, aftermath of the fire. And so these are people who are literally in the room as key moments happen in this case and in the aftermath. So one of the things that we learned is that the victims and the survivors, the victims' families and the survivors, are basically very quickly abandoned by the system that should have helped them survive this. They don't get mental health counseling that's effective at all. They don't get financial assistance. Some of them are literally kicked out onto the street, their belongings, evicted. They lose their homes, their cars. And so they are destitute, and they're not getting the help they need. So one of the inspiring things that happens is that some of the survivors decide to create their own fund, and they do it, and they raise millions of dollars to help these people eke their way through in the aftermath. So that's one of those inspiring stories. But one of the people I picked to follow their lives, not only does this person survive, literally left for dead, almost dies, but always comes and helps these funds. So he is in the room as this group is presented what can only be called a deal with the devil. And the deal with the devil is that the band that started the fire, that lit off the fireworks, that killed all of these people, offers to do a benefit tour or to help those victims and the survivors. And so they have to decide, will we take these people's money, the people who did this tragedy, who hurt all these people, killed all these people, will we allow them to now help us get out of this mess? So that's the type of like fly on the wall stuff that you get when you approach this as as a book, as opposed to maybe a newspaper article.
Those two things that you just touched on, I found really interesting. One being the extremely minuscule amount of money, I guess, that the band was insured for.
Yeah,
just $100
million.
Was it $1 million?
Right, but that doesn't go very far when you have
over 100 people, and then plus
hundreds. Yeah.
Hundreds. Yeah.
So the victims and then the survivors' families, it's still, what did they get? Probably next to nothing, I guess, each.
Well, eventually, some clever attorneys and a guy who's one of the characters in the book, a guy named Mac Twistow, figures out a different way. Because you're exactly right. They have about $1 million, and the club owners, the renters, they had about $1 million. Obviously the guy who owned the building, he had some insurance money. So there is some money, but even then, it doesn't add up to much when you've got 100 dead, and they've all got families and children that have been left behind. You've got hundreds more hurt. Some are going to require lifetime medical care. The ripple effect is kind of enormous.
Damn.
So Max figures out a way to actually go and change local laws. This is maybe one of the only in Rhode Island type aspects of the story. Goes to the state legislature, gets them to change law to allow him to broaden the scope of a lawsuit and to hold other people accountable or to sue them. So who are some of the other people? I mean, some of them are deep pockets. The promoters of the event. So all of these concerts are, of course, promoted usually by beer companies like Anheuser-Busch. So those are very deep pockets, and they have big insurance policies. So you're going after those people now, and you're going after the foam company, and you're going after, maybe we can go after the manufacturers of the foam, because really they made a dangerous product. It was obviously not properly cared for through the system so that it didn't kill. Well, let's go after them. You're talking like Dow Chemical. You're talking about huge corporations all of a sudden that you can go after. And so in the end, Max and his team get $176 million in settlements to help these victims' families and the survivors. But
Wonderful.
There's always a twist in this poor case. The lawyers end up taking like $59 million of that money. So now the pot is smaller. by the time the settlements happened, many of these victims, because many of them are working class people, blue collar folks, they have been preyed upon by others who have made deals with them. Basically said, you know what, you sign away your potential insurance settlement to me, and I'll give you some cash right now so you don't get evicted from your house, you don't lose your car. So an awful lot of people had made deals. So by the time the money actually got to them, they ended up getting, in reality, pennies on the dollar of what the settlement was really could have done for them. So, you know, tragedy builds upon tragedy with this case, and we see how the system on many, many levels really let them down. So even this spectacular settlement, it's not so spectacular when you really, you know, dissect it.
The other thing you touched upon was the deal with the devil. I like how you worded that, because that's exactly what it seems that it was. I guess the Jack Russell's Great White toured for, was it 2 years after the, was it a full 2 years? Not even?
Well, they kind of still tour. I mean, there's two versions of Great White that kind of exist right now.
I heard that didn't they stop the, at least the tour that was supposed to support the survivors. That tour stopped abruptly because the lead singer ended up having to go back to the rehab and then got a facelift or something on.
There's an awful lot of drama involving aging rock and roll bands, to say the least. Also, some of the venues dropped them because they were concerned about security. They had a tough time performing anywhere in New England because they were afraid that people would come up from Rhode Island and like maybe, you know, crash the stage or protest. Security concerns. All of that drama played out. There was even accusations at one point that the money that they were raising, that they were not handing it over to the charity. I don't know if that one was really ever, that there was any truth to that, but all of that played out as well. So, but yeah, Jack Russell is an interesting character. I mean, I talked to him a little bit for the book, and I went to see him perform. He still performs. And then he kept canceling our formal interview to kind of go through things. And in the end, we finally settled on a date. He had some friend of his pre-interview me for 3 hours to make sure I was cool. And I was all cleared to go. And then he called me the night before the formal interview and asked me for money. And
how much did he want?
I tried to explain to them in professional journalism, we don't do that. And then he asked me about a backdoor, which I think is a different way. Like, can I get money on if you know, profits, or if they're, you know, he doesn't really understand the book business, that there aren't really profits in the book business. But
no.
So anyway, he when I said no, that none of that was going to happen, then he would not speak to me anymore. But that doesn't mean we hear from Jack Russell, because one of the things that surfaces in the book is he did an interview really fairly recently in which he talks about how he has, before the fire, he had quite an interesting criminal past. So he had been in a attempted murder of his drug dealer way back when in California, and actually went to prison, served prison time for it. But he was a young man, so he released, I think, when he was like 21. But nobody knew about Jack Russell's criminal past. And that fascinates me too, is if you're a prosecutor looking for people to like, who can I possibly on? And everyone you look at, the roadie, the nightclub owners, none of these people have a criminal history, none. So, you know, but then you've got a guy who actually has a conviction for what you could argue is a depraved indifference to human life. And they don't even seem to know about it, the people who are investigating this case. So Jack Russell was never charged with anything and never really held accountable. People are still upset, and they feel like he hasn't really even apologized properly to folks for what happened. So,
how much did he want?
We never got that far because nothing was on the table. There was no offer.
I mean, where do you start? You know, it's like.
I was honestly surprised that when I'd heard that he got checked into a rehab for cocaine abuse at the end of that tour, I was honestly surprised that he could afford cocaine. You know, I'm not even trying to be funny with it.
I know, that's true.
I can't imagine their records flying off the shelves, you know, in that time period or even now. And, you know, how does an aging rock star that kind of hit MTV once, you know, continue to pay the bills, especially when you shut down the only income that they did have, which was touring, you know, through this horrific tragedy. So
But no,
yeah,
I've read 3 of his bankruptcy filings, and they're really interesting, and you learn an awful lot. He lives on a sinking houseboat on Redondo Beach, marina there. He values that at about $14,000, and that's his home, and that's where he's lived for years and years. So it's definitely a subsistence existence for Jack.
wow.
But you know, one of his filings, lawyers were upset because they said the one asset he has are the whatever payments he gets from that song from the Once Bitten Twice Shy, which still gets some radio play, and he failed to disclose that as an asset. So they were like, okay, well, Judge, this is not right. He's got one thing of value, and he's not even listing it as a thing of value. So the guy, he's surrounded by controversy whatever he does, it seems like.
Well, the writer gets the bulk of the money from a song no matter what. So he probably got really, 75 cents a record sold, or if it's playing on radio, I don't know how that would be, but
well, in these days, artists are really screwed because of streaming. They don't really make money off of recording. So yeah,
right.
It's not like it used to be.
Not like it used to be, no.
Yeah. But well,
horrific story. I do remember I had left New Jersey. I grew up in New Jersey. I left New Jersey in '98 after a little brief stint in the Marine Corps, and then came out here to California. So I was out here when it happened, but the ripple effects, like you said, just in the national news, and even from family in my hometown. Right? Did you hear about that? Because I was in and out of bands, playing guitar and stuff like that as a teenager. So I had a lot of friends that still play in bands back east.
Yeah.
And just horrific tale.
Well, look, a lot of people, because of this, now look to see where the exits are when they go to clubs and venues. There were some things that happened out of this that are hopeful. I think as a whole, there's still the system needs some work, to say the least. I don't think that the institutions that we think are going to protect us are protecting us, or those that we think are going to help us if we are in a tragedy like this are going to help us. But look, I went to here in San Francisco with the Bill Graham Auditorium, kind of near City Hall. I went to a concert in December there. It was so overcrowded, and there were so few exits. Of course, it's an old building. I really did fear and thought, well, if something goes wrong, we're all gone.
Yeah.
And this is today. This is in, well after this.
Yeah.
I went to a Ed Sheeran concert at a football stadium, and I'm like, there's no way I have my allotted 7 square feet to myself here. We're crammed in like sardines. So, and of course, a lot of things can go wrong, as we know at concerts, not just fires. This is the deadliest rock concert in American history, what happened with in Rhode Island, 100. It eclipses the awful tragedy that happened in Las Vegas with the shooter. Right, and the Pulse nightclub. These are awful tragedies, all have different sparks to why people died. This one trumps them all. And so I don't know that all of the lessons have been learned, but people do look for exits now as a result of this fire.
Were there more than just the front door as far as exits available? I had to wonder myself when I watched the footage. I know only one member of the band died, the guitar player, but how did the rest of the band get out of there? Because they were all the way in the back on the stage. It had to be like the back door, right? Right.
So there's a stage door that people could leave from. But as soon as the band gets out and maybe 2 more people, because that's where the fire started, there. The fire there in a matter of seconds is 1,400 degrees. So you as a human being, now this is impassable. You can't get past that to get to the door. So now you've got 2 other exits. The place had 4 exits. Each one was rated at being allowed to get 150 people per minute out of the building. That's how it's based on the width, how they come up with the number. So the stage door is effectively eliminated because that's where the fire is. The front door is effectively eliminated because everybody ran to it and caused a jam up. So we have 2 other exits. One people used to get out, and the other is through a kitchen. And just before the owners of the nightclub rented the place, the state had come in and taking down all of the exit signs for the emergency exit through the kitchen, because they determined that that's just unwise to have an emergency exit through a kitchen. So they took down anyone who would have given those 4 patrons a clue that there was a 4th exit. All those were eliminated by the fire inspector by code, according to him. Now, it's interesting that people who worked at the club, they all went out there because they saw the jam up at the front door. They saw that they couldn't get out the other way. They all went through the kitchen because they knew it was there. And an awful lot of people, it's very sad when you look at like the floor plan of like where people were found, the deceased, the people who perished. Many of them are right near that door through the kitchen that would have gotten them outside, and they would not have known about it because those signs had been eliminated by the inspector prior to the club, these owners coming in. So
another reason why how the state could have been held responsible. I mean, that's
right,
at least partially.
Right. Well, look, I'm sure that there's somebody who said there's some reason, like probably, well, the floor can be slippery in a kitchen, so that's not safe to have people go through there. But in a situation like this, when everything is happening in nanoseconds, you need every possible escape available and for people to know about it. So, everything went wrong. People call this the perfect storm of fires because so many things went wrong simultaneously, and if just one had not, probably everybody would have been alive. So look, the club owners they were some of the people who had never spoken until this book. They live with this every single day of their lives. They ask themselves these what if questions. What if we never bought that club, number one?
Yeah.
What if we'd never booked that band?
Yeah.
It wasn't the first time that Great White had been at the club. The first time they were there was an incident. They didn't do fireworks, but there was some incident with one of the band members picking up the girlfriend of a local, taking her in the tour bus, doing some things with her, and it caused this entire fight uprising, chasing through the streets of West Warwick, Rhode Island. I mean, they were, girl, right? So, so what if they'd never booked that band again? Great White had never done pyrotechnics as part of its local tour like this until this tour. So they decided to add this pizzazz. What if they'd not decided not to do this? What if the roadie had heeded the instructions of the people who sold him the fireworks? So he gave him 10 things you got to do. If you're going to do this stuff on your own, Dan, they said, here are the 10 things you need to do before every show. He did none of the 10. So what if he had? One of the 10 things was test it out while no one's in the club. Test it out to see if there's going to be a problem. If he had done that, this flammable stuff on the walls, had been there for years. It was just waiting for somebody to shoot sparks at it, which no one had done until then, or else the club would have burned down prior to that night. One of the things that was used by the prosecution in this case was they kept saying, well, these guys they were irresponsible. They were doing fireworks every night. And that's just simply not true. If fireworks had been done any time before then, the place would have ignited just the same way it did. This foam was an accelerant. It was not something that only lights up on Thursdays. It would have lit up on a Tuesday as well had there been fireworks used any other time.
Yeah, they tried that at the Stone Pony, the famous club where Bruce Springsteen, and that caused a big problem.
That guy went. They did that there. He was very upset, and in fact, he went to the New York Times in the aftermath of the fire. So the New York Times, it's really interesting. Within 24 hours, so in the first news cycle, as they say, the New York Times had gone and checked all the places that Great White had recently performed just before this disaster, because Great White, one of the stories that they said was that they had permission to light fireworks. So they checked with all these clubs, and all these clubs were like, first of all, they didn't have permission from us, and they did it here too. And some even said, we even told them they could not use fireworks, and they did it anyway. The guy at the Stone Pony that you talked about, he was the manager. He was so upset that he released the contract for to the newspaper that Great White had signed. Well, the contract included the rider, which, as you know, is very specific down to the brand of potato chips that they get in their dressing room.
Or the M&M colors, right?
There you go. And there's no mention in this whole contract about pyrotechnics. And in show business, they're going to charge for everything. And if pyrotechnics are part of, the show, you're paying for that. It's a line item. It's not in any contract. Yeah. It's not in any disclosure. And so he went that far. It's really interesting that because people were so upset and so riled up about this, and they were not satisfied with what they were hearing from investigators in the government, people start to come up with their own theories. And some of their own theories, of course, involve conspiracies. And one of the conspiracy theories is that all of these nightclub owners, that they all know each other and they all conspire with Great White. It's like, first of all, they don't know each other at all. And then I come up with a conspiracy within hours of a tragedy like this against Great White. That's just crazy. Especially now you've got to involve the New York Times being part of this conspiracy. It's just not possible. But that was what people like to say. They're like, well, you know, they all stick together, these guys. There's no sticking together.
No.
That's not the way
There's no sticking together in rock and roll. That's hilarious, actually. Oh, my God. Yeah, you know, you said about how everyone knows each other in Rhode Island. And I had a buddy from Rhode Island when it happened. And I said, you know, holy shit, you know, did you know anybody? And he was like, his cousin's like good buddy died. So I was like one person removed. So he was like, you know, so I remember when he was a kid, you know, it's like, geez.
So look, one of the legacies of this that's really interesting is we talked about that video, that awful video.
Yeah.
That awful video has had a life, not just the period life of people watching it on YouTube, but it's also had a life of its own afterwards. It has really done something interesting. So because we have this fire so well documented, that video is used to train nearly every firefighter in the United States. Learns this case. This is a case study because we know more about this fire than any other fire. We know second by second what happened. So that video is used to help train firefighters all over the United States, every fire investigator. They teach it at the ATF. I mean, it has become a tool to help people understand what happens with crowds panicking, with all the different things that went wrong here. And it's possible or likely that fire has actually helped save other people's lives. So it's had a weird afterlife that is, of course, you know, we all wish the fire itself had never happened, that there was never any fire at all, and that there was never any video. But they have made use of that, at least within the firefighting community, to try to help others.
I was amazed.
Yeah, it's so frightening.
Got out. It's because the cameraman was moving backwards, you know, and
you see him pushed out by the stampede. Yeah, you see that.
Yeah, but he made it out, which was just, you know, I was so surprised that just that short a period of time, because he was close to where it started. He was right there, you know, center stage.
Yeah, Brian Butler is one of the other people who spoke to me for the book, who had never spoken about what happened that night. Everybody wanted him the next day on the, you know, to be on 60 Minutes or on the morning shows or whatever. Because he, you know, had the front row seat to a horrible tragedy. He never spoke. He never did an interview. And I'm not sure why he decided to talk to me after all these years, probably because enough time had passed. But that was a really tough interview. He, you know, he was vilified in the aftermath of this. So again, in the absence of answers from the government or believable answers from the government, people start to make things up. And one of the things that people made up was that this guy knew that people were dying and he just wanted to get it on videotape.
Right.
Nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, people did not know that there had been a single death until like 5 the next morning. We look at this now because we look at things frame by frame and think, well, how could you not know that people were going to perish from this fire? But all of this happens in seconds. And he just does what a photog does. He keeps rolling. He moves outside. He goes for the wide shot. You can see this. He runs around the building. Yep. This is why we know that the band exit, by the way, was wide open and that people could have gotten out of there if the fire hadn't been raging in that one spot that prevented. This is all the stuff we know because of Brian Butler's video. But in the aftermath, he was painted to be a villain, some sort of uncaring person who just rolled tape while people died in front of his eyes. And that is simply not true. And he felt that, and he was demonized, and he was shunned for years and years. He would go to stories afterwards, and he'd be from that station, and of course, people didn't know what he looked like because you don't see him on camera. And he'd walk to a news story, and people would say, oh, you're from Channel 12. Well, you're welcome to come in as long as you're not that Brian Butler guy. People would say that because he was vilified as this ogre, which, you know, is simply not true. And those are the type of things that happen in the absence of a reasonable response from the government to let's find out what happened, let's see what went wrong, let's make sure this doesn't happen again. Instead, there was a big effort to scapegoat. And I think that's, something we should talk about as a country. Why do we always need scapegoats when something like this happens? But there is a price to pay for that. So Brian Butler never shared what he knew about the fire until this book. And so that's one of the facts that's laid out on the table now for you to consider when you think about this case, is his point of view.
If you watch the video, you could see that there had to be at least 15 or 20 other people outside of the door after he made it out that were either trying to help to pull people out of the place or just kind of standing there, but it was, what was he going to do if there were 15 or 20 other people right there at the entrance trying, doing the best they can? The best thing he could do is just stay out of the way. You have to know the difference. So that's just absurd that people would blame the cameraman.
Yeah, no, and you know what? His television station settled for $30 million because of this atmosphere of blame towards him. The attorneys argued that he could have been in people's way. People might have perished because he was there. So in fact, in that kind of clever lawsuit, that was the first of the big dominoes to fall. The big corporations to cave was his TV station. And when they settled for $30 million, and again, this is insurance companies paying out. This isn't like, people taking money out of their own pocket. Then the other corporations who had been sued all very quickly fell and did settlements. So had it not been for that TV station settling for that amount of money, I don't know that the victims and the survivors would have received much of anything at all.
That's a real shame. I don't know quite how I feel about that. On the one hand, I want to see the victims and the survivors, get as much, compensation as they possibly can. On the other hand,
right,
I don't see any blame for a journalist, or somebody with a camera, just doing basically his job that night. And if you just watch the video, you could see that he was whisked out of the club.
Yep.
There was no way in fact, I saw people that were in front of him afterwards that they were showing the footage looked like they were lollygagging to me. Like they weren't taking it seriously. Oh, why were you going out? That type of dumb shit.
No question.
Yeah.
There's one woman who said she was planning to go back in to get her coat. People did not know the severity of it.
Yeah.
Jack Russell is a, polarizing figure.
Yeah.
He is doing interviews outside as the news media arrives to promote the rest of his tour. He just knows that this club burned down. He doesn't know that anyone's dead. And so of course that's played out later as like, what an uncaring bastard. He's out promoting his tour while people are dead, but he doesn't know people are dead. So there's a little bit of, he may be an uncaring person. I don't know, but, or a self-centered guy, maybe. But in that moment, it's not fair to say that he knows people are dead and he's promoting his tour. That's not true. That's just not true. But those are the type of stories that came out of this that kind of haunt this case to this day. Probably the worst one, though, involves one of the co-owners of the club, one of the guys who was criminally charged. There was a story for years that as the building burned, as people were dying, that he ran back into the fire to save the cash register of the nightclub. And this was believed to be true. It even made a version of that story, even made it into the local newspaper. But we find out later when the grand jury testimony is released, the secret grand jury testimony finally is released to the public. We find out that in fact, the woman working the bar ran out with her tip jar and her cash drawer because she thought, I think initially, that it was a fight. She just heard, something, get out. She didn't see the fire. And so he sees her out standing outside with the cash register, the co-owner of the club, grabs it from her, throws it in the snowbank, and says, you have to help people. This is serious. And so then they go on to help people. So this moment here of him flinging the cash drawer into the snow becomes him running into the fire, full on, disaster. People are dying, and he goes for the money instead of helping people. And again, things that are just not true but that actually made it into the media, and that it was used to demonize that guy for years. And there are still people today, when the book came out, who actually contacted me and said, "How come you didn't put it in the book about the guy running in for the cash drawer?" It's like, well, because it's not true. It's just not true. So it's hard, though, because people have been fed a certain amount of misinformation for so many years that they just believe it to be true. And so you were asking about what is the reaction in Rhode Island. There are some people, not a lot of people, who are just have a fixed position on this. They have decided that what went down a certain way because that's the way they were told, and they're not really interested in listening to or considering any other viewpoints on it. And they still think to this day that somebody ran into a burning building and saved money while people died. They actually say that.
You got to be a nut to run into a burning building anyway, and firefighters are crazy to do what they do. But this particular fire, and I've seen other fires, firsthand, and been in them. Had my garage on fire and fought it. But this, like you said, because of that material on the ceiling, the way how quickly this spread. There's nothing inside that club that would have made me go back and unless I maybe had a loved one or something. I just can't see. And even then, I'd have to say but just looking at it and the smoke billowing out of it. So the idea of running back in there for money,
right?
That's absurdity.
Yeah.
But people say things like that. Look, I will say you need to know that there were people who did run into the flames. Obviously, the first responders, unbelievable heroism. They pulled people out. People lived because they ran into those flames and pulled people out. Just amazing.
Incredible. But
there were others. I think of a guy, Tracy King. He was a bouncer at the club. He was a bit of a character, kind of famous guy locally because he had been on the David Letterman show. Remember, David Letterman used to do the stupid human tricks? Is that what he called it? Yeah. So Tracy had this ability to balance things on his chin. And he went on the Letterman show and balanced a canoe in the Ed Sullivan Theater.
Wow.
On his chin. So kind of a character, amazing guy, life of the party. People loved him. Big guy. He runs into the fire, and 9 different people have credited him with pulling them out of the building and saving their lives. The last time he ran in, he did not come back out. And so he perished in the fire. So there were people who displayed unbelievable heroism to save others. And Tracy is one of those people.
Terrible. But hell of a story for somebody to do that, to risk their life and then lose it.
Yes.
That's Medal of Honor stuff.
Yeah.
Sorry, that would be Medal of Honor type material.
Sure. Yeah.
There's a civilian equivalent. I wonder why, or if anybody had considered even,
Well, maybe they will. I mean, I think that these stories. One of my motivations for doing this book was to make sure that this is not forgotten. I'm actually heartened and grateful when I see, the book just came out, so we're getting reviews like on Amazon and Goodreads and places like that. And I'm always touched when it's somebody from Omaha or Seattle or Saskatchewan or wherever they're in, and they're like, I never heard of this until I read this book. Now, a lot of these people are young people. This did happen in 2003, and so would not have been on their radar. So that's the type of response an author loves to hear, because we would like this to be remembered. We want these victims to be memorialized, but we also want to have lessons learned. And so when a young person says, I didn't know about this, and wow, what an incredible story, that is what you're looking for, to make sure this is not forgotten.
Yeah. And because of you, it will not be forgotten. Just what an incredible story. It was like literally a can of worms that opened up, and you did a great job.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. The time that you put into it, that's a long period of time to follow such a dark story, because it's a depressing story. It's not something you want to dwell on all the time, because it would could consume you, I imagine.
It's harder for the people I'm interviewing because, my process with these main characters, because we see the book so intimately through their eyes, I kind of invented my own process for how do we go deeper and deeper and deeper to get them to remember things, share intimate details that make for the book to come to life. So it was really hard for them. And there were days when I would say to myself, what am I doing? I mean, I'm going to these people and saying every time I see them is, hey, let's go back to the worst time ever in your life. And let's do a dive on that. But even you do a fact check with somebody on something who wasn't one of your central characters, but you wanted to just check some things out, and you'd end up 3 hours later, everybody's crying and trying to get through it. So yeah, that was really difficult. Obviously, much more difficult for them than for me. And I'm very grateful to people who went through that in order to make sure that this tragedy is not forgotten.
Wow. Well, thank you for writing the book.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for being on the show too. It was,
Absolutely. Yeah, for sharing the last hour with us and telling the story. Of course, the book's what everybody needs to go out and buy right now to get the full story with all the details of it. And like you said, they're an old person like myself tends to forget that 20 years pass by in the blink of an eye.
Right.
And that a whole nother generation of 20-year-olds now never heard of Great White or this horrible tragedy.
Station fire. Yeah.
Right.
So, all right. Well, thank you, Scott. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, guys.
Thanks a lot.
All right.
Yeah, it's been great. Good luck on your next endeavor.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right.
All right.
All right. Take care, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.